Today, a consumer market where horror comics struggle seems absurd, but the industry did experience such dark years. Even more inconceivable, there was a time when studios believed traditional horror movies had no commercial viability, despite compelling evidence to the contrary. When horror movies made a comeback, horror comic tales soon followed. However, they didn't return prominently to traditional comic books, because the Comics Code Authority's censorship rules barred many horrific and supernatural elements. Few small startups could produce horror anthologies to challenge the established superhero, romance, and Western comics on the stands, leaving the once popular staple moribund. The magazine rack was something different entirely, and Warren Publishing saw an opening that Creepy magazine filled. Soon, other horror comic magazines of varying quality would join Creepy and its fellow Warren titles, Eerie in 1965 and Vampirella in 1969, on the racks. It took a while for Marvel and DC Comics to re-enter the horror comics market, but even when they did, the Warren magazines retained an adult edge that kept them competitive. Horror's slow return. Universal's iconic monsters seemed to have no future when World War II ended and the Atomic Age began. Fright films focused on atomic horrors, giant monsters, and science-based creatures. While it is true that audiences grew tired of gothic monsters being enthralled to science fiction terrors, traditional horror could still sell, as evidenced by the shocking box office grosses of a 1951 Dracula/Frankenstein re-release and the massive success of 1953's House of Wax. The release of old Universal films to syndicated television in the late 1950s, combined with the success of Hammer and American International Pictures in the horror genre, led to a massive resurgence in horror film popularity. The renewed popularity of horror carried over into the comics industry, slowly. Publisher James Warren and editor Forrest J. Ackerman scored a massive success in 1958 with Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, a picture book with glowing articles on horror films. In late 1964, Warren Publishing released Creepy magazine, a decade after the strong-armed fall of horror and crime comics. Horror comics faded not due to lack of popularity, but because public controversies, fueled by Senate hearings and Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent campaign, prompted distributors to reconsider carrying horror comics, ultimately leading to the decline of horror monthlies. Interestingly, some may not know that EC Comics planned to release a fourth horror comic in 1955 titled The Crypt of Terror, which ironically became the final issue of Tales from the Crypt and the end of EC's entire horror line. Warren Publishing may have been hesitant about releasing a horror comic magazine in 1958, but it took a chance in late 1964 and scored a huge hit. Creepy would sell 200,000 to 300,000 copies, with each printing peaking at 350,000 by the late 1960s. Creepy's popularity certainly nudged Marvel and DC Comics to return to horror publishing. Marvel took things a step further by producing numerous black and white horror magazines in the 1970s. Comics to give you the creeps. The cover of Creepy magazine #1 is a case study in marketing brilliance. The whimsical cover featured Uncle Creepy sitting in a chair, presumably reading horror stories to a collection of traditional monsters and more malevolent beings. The cover depicted a yellow backdrop with the foreground imagery featuring the distinctive work of former EC artist Jack Davis, heralding the return of EC-style pulp comics. The intro by Uncle Creepy refers to the inaugural issue as the most exciting and imaginative magazine in 10 years. 10 is a magic number here. EC Comics ceased publication only a decade earlier. While Creepy did offer a new venue for former EC Comics artists to ply their trade, the editorial direction shifted away from EC's pulp magazine influences, updating classic horror comics anthology conventions to embrace the modern revival of classic horror comics and popular new releases from contemporary 1960s studios. Furthermore, consumers browsing magazine racks skewed older, and Creepy gave them more mature horror tales that avoided the juvenile tone standard comic books required to connect with much younger readers. Creepy intended to provide its customers with something edgier, but not so adult that it stressed violence over fun. Still, Creepy did not suffer from the Comics Code Authority's constraints, which set it apart from the comic book market.